The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Harvard Law School library as a young woman sat surrounded by towering stacks of legal books. Anita Thompson had always been different from her peers, not because she wanted to be, but because she had to be. As the only black woman in her class, she learned early on that being twice as prepared meant half as many questions about her capabilities. That dedication paid off when she graduated at the top of her class in 2010, silencing those who had doubted her from day one. But graduation was just the beginning of her journey. While her classmates headed to cushy corporate law firms, Anita chose a different path. She opened a small civil rights practice in Chicago's South Side, working from a modest office with mismatched furniture and a coffee maker that had seen better days. Her clients weren't Fortune 500 companies. They were everyday people fighting for their basic rights. A grandmother wrongfully evicted from her home of 30 years. A group of factory workers facing dangerous working conditions. A talented student denied college admission despite perfect grades. What Anita lacked in resources, she made up for in determination. She worked late into the night, often sleeping on the old couch in her office, poring over case law to find that one precedent that could turn everything around. Her colleagues started calling her the miracle worker after she won 3 cases that senior attorneys had deemed hopeless. One particular case put her on the map, defending a community center from being demolished to make way for luxury condos. The opposing counsel arrived with a team of 6 corporate lawyers, designer suits, and wheelie bags full of documents. Anita showed up alone, carrying a worn leather briefcase her father had given her when she passed the bar. The media dubbed it David versus Goliath. But Anita had a secret weapon. She'd spent weeks talking to community members, gathering their stories, understanding why this center mattered. When she presented her case, she didn't just cite legal statutes. She painted a picture of children learning to read, elderly folks finding companionship, and families building better lives together. The victory made headlines across Chicago. Soon, more challenging cases started coming her way. Anita developed a reputation not just for winning, but for changing the way people thought about justice. She didn't just fight in the courtroom. She fought in the court of public opinion, writing powerful op-eds and giving speeches that made complex legal issues accessible to everyone. Her office grew, but she kept it purposefully small and focused. She hired young lawyers who reminded her of herself, hungry for justice, willing to work hard, and passionate about making real change. They worked together like a family, celebrating victories with cheap champagne and comforting each other through tough losses. What no one knew was that Anita's growing reputation had caught the attention of people in very high places. As she prepared for what seemed like just another important case, forces were moving behind the scenes that would change her life forever. The courthouse loomed before Anita Thompson like a mountain of marble and tradition. Today's discrimination case against a major tech company wouldn't be easy, but those were exactly the kind she lived for. Walking up the steps, briefcase in hand, she went through her opening arguments one last time in her head. Inside the courtroom, Judge Richard Harrison sat on his bench, peering down through wire-rimmed glasses. He was known for his traditional views and by-the-book approach. As Anita set up her materials at the counsel's table, she could feel his dismissive gaze. "Where's the lead counsel?" Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the courtroom. He was looking right past Anita, scanning a room for someone else. "Item lead counsel, Your Honor," Anita replied, standing tall. Anita Thompson, representing the plaintiffs. The judge's eyebrows shot up. He looked down at his papers, then back at her, making no attempt to hide his skepticism. "Very well," he said, his tone suggesting it was anything but well. The case involved 5 brilliant programmers who'd been passed over for promotion repeatedly, despite their outstanding performance records. What made this case special wasn't just the discrimination they'd faced. It was the paper trail they'd gathered, proving a pattern that went back years. As Anita began her opening statement, Judge Harrison interrupted her 3 times in the first 5 minutes. Each time, His questions seemed designed to throw her off balance. "Counsel, are you familiar with the precedent set in Anderson v. Tech Solutions?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted she would be. Anita didn't just know the case. She'd studied every detail of it. She quoted directly from the decision, then explained precisely how it supported her client's position. A flicker of surprise crossed the judge's face, quickly replaced by his usual stern expression. Throughout the morning, the pattern continued. Every time Anita made a point, the judge questioned her expertise. When she called her first witness, he scrutinized every question as if she were a first-year law student. But Anita had dealt with this kind of treatment before. It had shaped her into the lawyer she was. What Judge Harrison didn't know was that just that morning, Anita had received a cryptic call from the White House counsel's office. They'd asked for her complete case history and a detailed background check. She'd wondered about the timing, but now, standing in this courtroom, fighting yet another battle against prejudice, she was too focused on her clients to give it much thought. The real surprise came during cross-examination. The defense lawyer, thinking he could rattle her, brought up a recent Supreme Court decision. Without missing a beat, Anita connected it to 3 other cases, building an argument so solid that even Judge Harrison had to nod in reluctant appreciation. By the end of the day, whispers were circulating through the courthouse. Not just about the brilliant arguments they'd witnessed, but about something bigger brewing in Washington. But for now, Anita remained focused on one thing: justice for her clients, no matter who stood in her way. The tension in the courtroom could be cut with a knife as the trial entered its second day. Anita Thompson stood her ground as Judge Harrison's interruptions became more frequent and his tone increasingly condescending. The case was strong, but the judge seemed determined to find any possible flaw in her arguments. "Counsel," he said, cutting her off mid-sentence for the 4th time that morning, "perhaps you're not familiar with federal procedure in these matters." The question dripped with patronizing assumption. Anita took a deep breath, remembering her father's words. Sometimes, the quietest voice carries the most weight. She smiled politely and replied, "Your Honor, if you'll allow me to continue, I'll demonstrate exactly how federal procedure supports our position." In the gallery, a group of young law students watched in awe. They'd heard about this case and came to see the legendary Anita Thompson in action. What they witnessed was a masterclass in grace under pressure. Every time the judge tried to throw her off balance, she responded with precisely cited cases and rock-solid arguments. During the lunch break, Anita overheard 2 veteran attorneys talking in the courthouse corridor. "Have you ever seen Harrison this rattled?" One whispered, "She's not just winning the case. She's challenging everything he thought he knew about who belongs in his courtroom." Back inside, Anita called her star witness, a senior programmer with 20 years of experience. As the witness described being passed over for promotion 6 times in favor of less qualified candidates, Judge Harrison's interruptions took on a different tone. He was still challenging, but now there was something else in his voice. A growing realization that this case was far stronger than he'd initially assumed. The afternoon brought a surprising turn. When the defense attorney tried to discredit the witness's testimony, Anita's objection was so well-crafted that Judge Harrison had no choice but to sustain it. The look of surprise on his face didn't escape notice. Several people in the courtroom exchanged knowing glances. What made the moment even more powerful was what the judge didn't know. Earlier that morning, another call had come from Washington. This time, they wanted to know about her handling of constitutional law cases. The White House vetting process was moving faster than usual, but Anita remained focused on the present battle. By day's end, even the defense team seemed shaken. They'd come in expecting to face a pushover, someone they could easily dismiss. Instead, they'd encountered a legal force of nature. As Anita packed up her briefcase, she noticed Judge Harrison watching her with an unreadable expression. Outside the courthouse, her phone buzzed again. Washington calling. But right now, all that mattered was tomorrow's final arguments. Whatever was brewing in D.C. would have to wait. She had a case to win, and more importantly, clients counting on her to deliver the justice they deserved. The tension in the courtroom could be cut with a knife as the trial entered its second day. Anita Thompson stood her ground as Judge Harrison's interruptions became more frequent and his tone increasingly condescending. The case was strong, but the judge seemed determined to find any possible flaw in her arguments. "Counsel," he said, cutting her off mid-sentence for the fourth time that morning, "perhaps you're not familiar with federal procedure in these matters." The question dripped with patronizing assumption. Anita took a deep breath, remembering her father's words. Sometimes, the quietest voice carries the most weight. She smiled politely and replied, "Your Honor, if you'll allow me to continue, I'll demonstrate exactly how federal procedure supports our position." In the gallery, a group of young law students watched in awe. They'd heard about this case and came to see the legendary Anita Thompson in action. What they witnessed was a masterclass in grace under pressure. Every time the judge tried to throw her off balance, she responded with precisely cited cases and rock-solid arguments. During the lunch break, Anita overheard two veteran attorneys talking in the courthouse corridor. "Have you ever seen Harrison this rattled?" one whispered. "She's not just winning the case. She's challenging everything he thought he knew about who belongs in his courtroom." Back inside, Anita called her star witness, a senior programmer with 20 years of experience. As the witness described being passed over for promotion 6 times in favor of less qualified candidates, Judge Harrison's interruptions took on a different tone. He was still challenging, but now there was something else in his voice. The moment of truth had arrived. The courtroom was packed as Anita Thompson rose for her closing arguments. Even the usually restless reporters sat still, sensing they were about to witness something special. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor," Anita began, her voice clear and steady, "this case is about more than just 5 talented programmers denied their fair chance. It's about the promise we make as a society, that merit, not prejudice, will determine how far we can go." She didn't need notes. Every fact, every precedent, every piece of evidence flowed naturally as she built her argument. The judge, who had spent days interrupting her, now sat in complete attention. The transformation in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. "The evidence shows a clear pattern," she continued, presenting graphs that tracked promotion rates. "When equally qualified candidates were considered, our clients were consistently overlooked. The numbers tell the story, but behind these statistics are real people whose careers, dreams, and families have been affected." In the gallery, her clients sat with tears in their eyes. They'd waited years for someone to fight for them like this. The defense team shuffled uncomfortably in their seats as Anita systematically dismantled their arguments. Judge Harrison's ruling came faster than anyone expected. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, he announced, "This court finds in favor of the plaintiffs." The courtroom erupted in muted cheers. But then something unprecedented happened. The judge added, "Counsel, I must acknowledge the exceptional quality of your presentation. You've shown remarkable skill and professionalism throughout these proceedings." As Anita gathered her papers, a court officer rushed in with an urgent message. All phones in the courtroom suddenly started buzzing. The president was about to make an important announcement. Judge Harrison reached for his own phone, his eyes widening as he read the breaking news. He looked up at Anita, who was still focused on comforting her celebrating clients, completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. The headlines were already spreading. History made. Brilliant civil rights attorney nominated to Supreme Court. The same judge who had doubted her credentials just days ago was about to learn that he'd been court testing a future Supreme Court justice. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with excitement during lunch hour. Judge Harrison sat at his usual corner table, absently stirring his coffee while the TV above played the president's announcement. His colleagues watched his reaction as Anita Thompson's face appeared on the screen. I am proud to nominate one of our nation's most brilliant legal minds to the Supreme Court. The president's voice filled the room. Someone who, even as we speak, continues to fight for justice in our courts. The color drained from Judge Harrison's face as realization dawned. The attorney he'd spent days underestimating was about to become one of the highest-ranking judicial officers in the country. His fellow judges gathered around his table, some hiding smirks, others openly grinning. "Quite a way to learn about our new Supreme Court Justice, Ed Richard," one of them teased. Meanwhile, Anita stood in her office, surrounded by her small but dedicated team, watching the same announcement. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the news broke. Her secretary held back tears of joy as she fielded calls from media outlets worldwide. "I always knew you were destined for greatness," her longtime paralegal whispered, hugging her tightly. The afternoon brought an awkward but necessary encounter. Protocol required Judge Harrison to formally congratulate her. He found her in the courthouse lobby, still discussing case details with her clients, putting their needs first despite her historic nomination. "Your Honor." She acknowledged him with a gentle smile, showing no sign of triumph or revenge. Harrison cleared his throat. "Miss Thompson, soon-to-be Justice Thompson, I owe you an apology. My behavior during this trial was exactly why I became a lawyer," she finished for him. "To change perspectives, one case at a time." The local bar association hastily arranged a congratulatory event that evening. As Anita entered the room, every attorney, judge, and law clerk rose in a standing ovation. Judge Harrison stood at the back, witnessing the respect she'd earned long before any Supreme Court nomination. During her brief speech, she never mentioned the prejudice she'd faced. Instead, she focused on the work ahead, the responsibility of the position, and her commitment to equal justice under law. Her words carried no hint of bitterness, only hope for a better future. The Senate hearing room hummed with anticipation. Anita Thompson sat alone at the witness table, facing rows of senators ready to examine her qualifications. Her simple black suit and pearl necklace, a gift from her grandmother, stood in stark contrast to the ornate chamber. "Miss Thompson," the committee chairman began, "your record is impressive, but there's been much discussion about an incident during your recent case. Could you tell us about your experience with Judge Harrison?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew about the judge's treatment of her, and many expected her to use this moment for payback. Instead, she smiled thoughtfully. "That experience," she replied, "reinforced what I've always believed, that justice isn't about personal grievances, but about growing together as a society. Judge Harrison and I started that case as adversaries and ended it with mutual respect. That's the power of our legal system at its best." Her answer left the senators momentarily speechless. One of her critics had prepared to attack her based on anticipated bitterness, but now had to scramble for a different approach. As the questioning continued, she handled every topic with the same grace, from constitutional interpretation to modern technology law. When asked about her humble beginnings, she spoke of her parents' sacrifice to send her to law school. In the audience, Judge Harrison watched the proceedings on a small TV in his chambers. Each thoughtful answer made him sink deeper into his chair, remembering his own prejudiced assumptions. The most powerful moment came when a senator asked about bias in the justice system. "I've experienced bias," she acknowledged, "but I've also witnessed tremendous change. Every time we choose understanding over assumption, we move forward. My story isn't about overcoming one judge's preconceptions. It's about proving that justice can transcend all barriers." The press called it a masterclass in judicial temperament. Even her strongest opponents struggled to find fault with her composed, insightful responses. By day's end, her confirmation seemed all but certain. That evening, an envelope arrived at her hotel. Inside was a handwritten note from Judge Harrison. "You've taught me more about justice in a few days than I learned in decades on the bench. Our legal system will be better with you on the Supreme Court." The Senate vote was set for a historic afternoon. Anita Thompson sat in her small office one last time, touching the worn leather chair where she'd spent countless nights preparing cases. The walls were already half bare, her law books packed in boxes, ready for the move to Washington. Her phone lit up with the final tally, 94-6. An overwhelming confirmation. Messages flooded in from former clients, law school classmates, and even those who'd once doubted her. But the message that touched her most came from a young law student who'd watched her court battle with Judge Harrison. "You showed us that dignity wins more battles than anger," the student wrote. "You changed how I see justice." At the celebration dinner, Anita's small team gathered one last time. Her paralegal of 10 years couldn't hold back tears as she raised a toast to the justice who never forgot what it means to fight for the little guy. The next morning, newspapers across the country carried the story. Photos showed Anita standing with her elderly parents, who'd worked multiple jobs to put her through school. Her mother clutched a tissue, while her father stood straight-backed, pride radiating from his weathered face. Judge Harrison made a surprise appearance at the courthouse farewell. He changed in the weeks since their case, becoming an advocate for diversity in the legal profession. "Your appointment," he told her quietly, "isn't just history made, it's history corrected." As Anita packed her last box, she found an old photo from her first day as a lawyer. She'd been standing alone outside her tiny office, holding a handmade sign. Thompson Legal Services, Justice for All. Now she was headed to the highest court in the land. The cleaning staff, security guards, and courthouse regulars lined the halls as she walked out for the last time. These were the people she'd greeted every morning, whose children's stories she knew, whose dreams she'd encouraged. Their applause echoed through the marble corridors. Outside, a group of young black girls waited with flowers. One stepped forward. "You showed us what's possible." Anita hugged each one, remembering her own childhood dreams of justice. The Supreme Court chambers glowed in morning sunlight as Anita Thompson prepared to take her oath. The room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists, politicians, and citizens gathered to witness history. Her simple black robe hung ready, representing not just her achievement, but generations of dreams. Her old office team sat in the front row, alongside clients from her most meaningful cases. The tech company programmers she defended were there too, now leading their own departments. Judge Harrison had chosen a quiet spot in the back, watching the culmination of a journey that had changed them both. The Chief Justice stepped forward with the Bible. Anita placed her hand on it, remembering her grandmother's words. "Baby, when you get your chance, remember all those who never got theirs." Her voice rang clear through the chamber. "I do solemnly swear that I will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich." Each word carried the weight of her past battles and future responsibilities. As she took her seat on the bench for the first time, she noticed a small envelope. Inside was a note from Judge Harrison. "Justice prevails in more ways than one. Your presence here rights many wrongs, including my own." That afternoon, she made an unexpected stop at her old neighborhood courthouse. The cleaning staff rushed to hug her, and security guards stood straighter, beaming with pride. She walked to her former courtroom, now empty and quiet. Standing at the spot where she'd faced doubt and prejudice, she smiled. On the judge's bench lay a single rose with a card. "Thank you for teaching an old judge new lessons. Harrison." Later, in her new chambers, she hung two photos side by side, one of her first tiny office and another of today's ceremony. Between them, she placed a simple quote, "Justice sees no color, only truth." That evening, as she left the Supreme Court building, she stopped to talk with the maintenance staff, learning their names just as she had at her old courthouse. Some things, she decided, shouldn't change with the title.